Have you ever walked into an old building and felt like something was still there? The boarding house on Elm Creek Road, just a few miles south of what used to be Deadwood Gulch, still carries a smell that refuses to leave. Locals say it's just mold, damp wood, and decades of dust. But visitors describe something else entirely. A sweet, heavy stench that sticks to your clothes even after you've left. Back in 1854, this same house sheltered 43 gold-hungry miners. By winter's end, most of them had fled, 36 men swearing they'd rather starve in the Dakota hills than eat one more bite of food cooked inside that kitchen. Official records say 7 miners died that year. All 7 were married to the same woman within the span of 12 months. Her name? Martha Sinclair. What the records don't say is why her enormous iron stew pot was found buried 6 feet behind the house. Or why her handwritten recipe book mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse on the very night she vanished. Now, before we dive into this twisted chapter of Deadwood Gulch's past, make sure you're subscribed. These are the kinds of stories you won't find in history textbooks. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because stories like this didn't just happen here. They happened everywhere. For more than a century, the truth stayed buried. Until a construction crew unearthed something so disturbing, the county coroner refused to file a report at all. See Deadwood. Gulch wasn't the wild boomtown most people picture when they hear the name. Deadwood. This was smaller, desperate, a cluster of rough shacks clinging to the narrow valley where Elm Creek cut through the Dakota Territory. When the first specks of gold showed up in the creek bed, the place exploded. From 12 families to over 200 fortune seekers in just 6 weeks. There was no law, no doctor, and not much hope. Miners lived in canvas tents or damp dugouts hacked into the hillsides. The handful of wooden buildings charged outrageous prices for food, for shelter, for anything at all. And then Martha arrived. She came in a wagon train from Missouri, carrying just a leather satchel, a massive cooking pot so heavy it took 4 men to unload, and a letter of introduction from a husband she said had died of consumption. She was 34, hair already streaked with gray. Her hands bore the stains of years spent around fire and iron, and the way she looked at people. She didn't meet their eyes. She stared just below at the chest, like she was measuring something you couldn't see. Within days, she had bought the largest building in the Gulch, an abandoned 2-story left behind when its owner died in a mining accident. It sat at the crossroads of the main trail and the richest claims. Prime real estate. Martha turned it into a boarding house almost overnight. Handwritten signs promised clean beds, hot meals, fair prices, no credit, no exceptions. The place filled immediately. Miners used to beans and hardtack couldn't believe what came out of her kitchen. Stews thick with meat and vegetables. Fresh warm bread. Somehow, eggs and milk, even though the nearest farm was 100 miles away. Word spread fast. Martha Sinclair's cooking was the best in the territory. Especially her meat stews. Rich. Complex. Unlike anything they'd tasted before. But not everyone was convinced. Thomas Brennan, once a butcher in St. Louis, noticed something strange. The meat Martha served didn't look like beef or pork. It was tender, fine-grained, almost familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. When he asked Martha where it came from, she just smiled that unsettling smile and told him a woodswoman traded her deer and elk for sugar and flour, but Thomas had hunted deer. He had butchered elk, and this wasn't either. Then came Samuel Fletcher. He arrived in late April, a leather pouch of gold clinking at his side. A giant of a man, 6.5 feet tall, broad enough to fill a doorway, with hands like dinner plates. He had struck a promising vein and needed a safe place to stay. More importantly, somewhere his gold could be hidden until he had enough to head back east to his family. Martha noticed him instantly. She made sure his meals were extra generous. His coffee was always hot. His room, the best in the house, was spotless. She asked him about his family, his claim, his future. After months of living in a tent alone, Samuel welcomed her attention. Within 2 weeks, he was more than just her tenant. He was staying late to help wash dishes, talking deep into the night. She was sharp, well-read, and carried stories of traveling through immigrant communities across the Midwest, each with their own cooking secrets. The other boarders saw the favoritism. His plates were fuller, his bread fresher, his coffee stronger. But if Martha was in a good mood, everyone ate better. So most of them let it slide. On May 15th, Exactly 1 month after Samuel arrived, Martha announced their engagement. The wedding would be the following Sunday, performed by a traveling preacher. Afterward, another one of her famous feasts. Samuel seemed surprised by how fast things were moving. But in a place like Deadwood Gulch, who had the luxury of waiting? The wedding feast would go down in history, but not for the reasons anyone expected. They said Martha Sinclair could cook a meal that made hardened miners close their eyes and sigh like children at their mother's table. One stew in particular left men talking about it for weeks. The meat was impossibly tender, flavored with herbs nobody could name, and there was always enough for second and even third helpings. Some swore it was the best meal of their lives. A few even joked that Martha ought to write her recipes down before some rival boarding house stole her secrets. But 3 weeks after that feast, tragedy struck. Samuel Fletcher, Martha's brand new husband, was dead. He had complained of stomach pain and fever for a couple of days, but then his condition nosedived. Dr. Ephraim Mills, the only physician wandering through 3 separate mining camps, called it dysentery complicated by exhaustion. Nothing unusual in a place where filth, bad water, and lack of medical care killed men all the time. Martha, of course, seemed crushed. She locked herself away for 2 full days. No cooking, no conversation. When she finally emerged, she was dressed head to toe in mourning black. Clothes no one could explain how she had acquired out here in the Dakota wilderness. She drifted through the boarding house like a ghost of grief. The boarders pitied her. They brought gifts, offered to help with chores, tried to ease the weight of her loss. Samuel's funeral drew the whole settlement. He had been well liked, even in his short time there. Martha stood by the graveside, pale but dignified, clutching a handkerchief she never once raised to her eyes. And no one, not a single mourner, knew the truth. Samuel Fletcher was not in that coffin. That box was filled with rocks and dirt. His real body had been taken apart in Martha's kitchen the night after he died. Every usable cut of flesh preserved with salt and stacked neatly in the root cellar below. The giant iron pot, scrubbed and seasoned, waiting for its next stew. Within a week, the boarding house was running as if nothing had happened. Martha's cooking, if anything, tasted better than before. She leaned heavily on stews and braised dishes, avoiding roasts. Most assumed roasting reminded her of meals with Samuel, but the truth was darker. By mid-June, a newcomer arrived. Henrik Stoltz, a blacksmith from Wisconsin. Unlike Samuel, he wasn't hunting for gold. He was building something lasting. A forge, a business, a future. For Martha, Heinrich was perfect, steady, skilled, reliable, exactly the kind of man a widowed landlady would want by her side. He set up his forge behind the boarding house, and within days, he and Martha grew close. The courtship played out fast, too fast. Just like with Samuel, her attention never wavered, his meals always bigger, his room spotless, her interest in his work constant. Henrik, still grieving a wife who had died 2 years before, welcomed Martha's warmth. On July 4th, the settlement celebrated not just Independence Day, but also their wedding. Martha hosted another legendary feast. Her massive pot overflowed with stew, packed with rich meats and spiced with flavors nobody in Dakota had ever tasted. Fresh bread, impossible vegetables for the season. It was nothing short of miraculous. 3 weeks later, Henrik was dead. Same symptoms, same pattern. Stomach pain, fever, then gone. The good doctor chalked it up to heat exhaustion and food poisoning, blaming Henrik's German constitution for not holding up in the harsh frontier. And once again, Martha performed her familiar grief ritual. 2 days locked away in mourning, then back to work, black dress flowing, dignity intact. The boarders pitied her again. 2 husbands gone in 3 months, it seemed almost cruel. At Henrik's funeral, Martha claimed she had prepared his body herself, as any wife should. She said she'd learned the rites from her grandmother in Missouri. Everyone nodded, touched by her devotion. But what they didn't realize was chilling. Henrik, like Samuel, wasn't in that coffin. His flesh had been carved, salted, preserved. His blood and fat seasoning Martha's iron pot until it gleamed darker than ever. By August, people began to whisper. Her food was too good. Stews with flavors so deep and layered they seemed impossible. Meat so perfectly marbled and rich that no one could explain it. Where was Martha getting her ingredients? Thomas Brennan, the former butcher, was more than just curious. He was suspicious. He had tasted every kind of livestock before, but this wasn't pork, beef, venison, or anything he could name. And as he pressed Martha with questions, she dodged every single one with a smile and a vague story. Then came James Crawford, drifting into Deadwood Gulch in mid-August, running from debts back in Kansas City. And with him, the cycle was about to begin all over again. What if I told you Martha Sinclair's charm wasn't just in her cooking, but in the men she buried? James Crawford was different from the husbands who came before him. He wasn't a serious man of business like Samuel, or a practical blacksmith like Heinrich. No, James was all charm, an easy smile, a good joke always ready. He could play cards, spin stories, and keep a whole room laughing on the darkest nights. And Martha? She fell for it. Unlike her measured, almost calculated courtships with the others, her time with James looked like something close to love. Evening walks along the creek, long private talks that stretched until sunrise. She laughed more. She blushed. She seemed younger, lighter, like James had pulled her back into the world. Their whirlwind romance ended in marriage on September 2nd, just 2 weeks after meeting. At the wedding feast, Martha unveiled her famous stew again, but this one was different. The flavor was richer, more layered, more complex than ever. Some swore it had the texture of multiple meats, blended so perfectly it created something no one had ever tasted before. 3 weeks later, James was gone. Same story. Stomach cramps, fever, then death. Dr. Mills had noticed the pattern by now, but in his eyes it was simple. Bad sanitation, bad luck. He advised Martha to improve her food storage, advice she smiled at politely, then ignored completely. And then, barely a month later, husband number 4 appeared, William O'Brien, an Irish immigrant willing to risk his life working the most dangerous claims for a bigger share of gold. Martha's interest was immediate. Within days, she was making eyes at him. Within 2 weeks, October 15th, they were married, but William's death, less than a month later, wasn't quite as neat as the others. Neighbors overheard arguments between William and Martha the night before he fell ill. The walls of the boarding house were thin, but no one could make out the words. The next morning, Thomas Brennan saw something that stuck with him. Martha leaving at dawn, carrying a heavy canvas bundle, returning hours later empty-handed. When William finally died on November 8th, his belongings, including a significant stash of gold dust, had mysteriously vanished. Martha claimed he'd asked her to send everything to his family in Boston. Convenient, but odd, since none of her other husband's possessions had been sent anywhere. By now, whispers spread through the boarding house. Even the most trusting boarders were unsettled. But one man, Thomas Brennan, the former butcher, wasn't just uneasy. He was convinced something was very, very wrong. He knew meat. He knew texture, marbling, grain. And what Martha served wasn't beef, pork, venison, or anything you could buy from a trader. He had tasted this before years ago back in St. Louis, when he'd helped prepare cadavers for medical schools. Human flesh. And the more he ate, the more certain he became. By mid-November, Thomas was keeping a secret journal. He tracked every meal, every change in Martha's recipes. He noted how her food always seemed to improve dramatically right after a husband's death, as if a fresh supply of premium cuts had just arrived. On November 15th, Thomas did something he never thought he'd do. He broke into Martha's root cellar. What he found was worse than his darkest suspicions: salted remains. At least 4 different bodies, butchered and preserved with the skill of a professional. Each cut carefully labeled in Martha's delicate handwriting, notes about aging, flavor, seasoning, like a cookbook for human meat. And there was more, a private journal documenting every marriage and every kill. Each entry listed the husband's weight, health, the amount of usable meat their body provided. Detailed recipes refined through trial and error, which cuts worked best for stew, which needed to age before braising, and then the trophies, wedding rings, watches, nuggets of gold, documents, every possession of every husband cataloged and stored, hidden away as souvenirs of her crimes. For Thomas, it was undeniable. Martha Sinclair wasn't just a grieving widow with bad luck. She was a predator, a butcher, a cannibal, but what could he do? Deadwood Gulch had no sheriff. No judge, no law. If he accused her without proof, she could kill him before sunrise and add his flesh to her cellar. So Thomas stayed quiet. He kept his head down. And he kept writing, documenting everything, waiting for the moment when he could finally expose her. What happened next would change the town forever. Bottom of form. What if I told you the deaths at Martha's boarding house weren't just tragic coincidences, but part of a chilling pattern that was getting harder and harder to ignore? By late November, a Polish immigrant named Daniel Kowalski arrived in Deadwood Gulch. He barely spoke English, had no family nearby, and after weeks of freezing in a tent, Martha's warm boarding house must have felt like a blessing. Thomas Brennan tried to warn him, tried to tell him the truth, but Daniel brushed it off as jealousy or prejudice, and just like the others, Martha moved fast. She played the role of protector, guide, and even translator for Daniel. Their wedding took place on December 8th, complete with a lavish feast. Martha even claimed to honor Daniel's heritage by preparing a traditional Polish dish. But this time, his death came differently. On December 27th, Daniel simply never woke up. No slow illness, no drawn-out suffering, just gone. When Dr. Mills asked to examine the body, Martha refused, hiding behind religious customs. By the time the doctor pushed harder, it was too late. Daniel was already buried. Then came Robert Chen in January, a skilled cook from China. And this was dangerous for Martha. Robert actually knew about butchering, seasoning, preparation. He admired her cooking, even asked to learn from her. Imagine Thomas's horror as he watched Martha begin her familiar seduction. He tried to warn Robert too, but language and cultural barriers kept the message from sinking in. They married on January 23rd. By February 14th, Robert was dead. Healthy one day, poisoned the next. And this time, Thomas realized something terrifying. Martha wasn't just repeating her crimes. She was growing careless, confident, as if she believed no one would ever stop her. But then, something shifted. On February 20th, Peter Olsen walked through the boarding house door. A towering Norwegian, nearly 6'4", with the build of a soldier and the sharp eyes of a man who missed nothing. Unlike the others, Peter wasn't here chasing gold. He'd been hired by a mining syndicate in Chicago to investigate fraud, vanishing workers, and suspicious deaths across the frontier. He was a soldier, a tracker, and, most dangerous for Martha, an investigator. From the very first night, things felt different. When Peter signed the guest book, Martha lingered on his handwriting, his composure, his measured answers. He was polite but vague, refusing to be pinned down. And when she tried to steer him into her usual courtship questions, family, money, future plans, Peter noticed. He knew when someone was sizing him up as prey. At dinner, while the other boarders devoured Martha's stew with delight, Peter ate slowly. He studied each bite like a man on a mission. His compliments were restrained, his eyes cautious. He wasn't just eating, he was analyzing. And here's the twist. Martha wasn't the only one hunting. Peter began digging, asking questions about the boarding house's past tenants. He played it casual, like he was just curious about romantic stories, but the answers he got painted a chilling pattern. 7 men, less than a year, all young, healthy, and well off, all gone within weeks of marrying Martha. For the first time, Martha had met her match, and what happened next would push this deadly game of cat and mouse to a whole new level. What if the meals you'd been praising for months, the ones you swore were the best you'd ever tasted, turned out to be something far darker than food? That's exactly what the boarders at Martha's boarding house were about to discover. Peter Olsen had been piecing things together. The stories didn't add up. Every husband of Martha's had supposedly died of common frontier ailments: dysentery, fever, spoiled food, heat exhaustion. But the symptoms? They didn't match what Peter knew about those conditions. And the speed of the deaths? Too fast, too convenient. Even worse, Martha had personally handled every burial, refusing outside help, controlling the process from start to finish. Thomas Brennan, who'd carried his suspicions for months, saw his chance. Peter was different, sharp, disciplined, cautious. But Thomas had to be careful. One wrong move and Martha would add him to her cellar stockpile. So Thomas played it smart. During a late-night card game, he steered the talk toward food in the mining camps. He praised Martha's cooking, then slyly questioned where she was getting such fine meat. He casually dropped in his background as a butcher, hinting that he recognized things the others didn't. Peter didn't laugh it off. He leaned in. He asked precise, unnerving questions, the kind that showed he wasn't afraid to follow a thought all the way to its darkest conclusion. Night after night, their secret partnership grew. In public, just two men sharing idle talk. In private, coded conversations, trading suspicions piece by piece. Both knew Martha was a killer. Both knew she was dangerous. Peter's investigation was methodical. He studied the boarding house itself, its layout, its storage, its locked doors. The root cellar immediately caught his eye. Always locked, always guarded. And Martha had a rigid schedule. Certain days she left for shopping trips. That's when Peter made his move. What he found beneath that house was worse than he imagined. Neatly wrapped packages of preserved flesh. Journals cataloging every victim, weight, yield, preferred cuts. Personal belongings stolen from the dead, stacked like trophies. It wasn't just evidence. It was a system. But Peter knew evidence wasn't enough. Deadwood had no proper law, no sheriff who'd ride in and handle this. If Martha was going to be stopped, she had to be exposed, publicly, undeniably. So he and Thomas laid a trap. On March 15th, Martha began preparing what Peter immediately recognized as human liver. He'd been watching closely, her practiced hands, her offhand remarks, her unnatural familiarity with handling organs no woman should know how to prepare. But instead of springing the accusation then, he waited. He waited until the boarders were gathered at the dinner table, bowls ready, stomachs growling. That's when Peter struck. He told them what they were about to eat. He showed them the proof he and Thomas had gathered. At first, shock, denial, then realization, and horror. The men who had once begged for second helpings of Martha's stew were suddenly gagging, heaving, some furious, some sick. Rage and nausea mixed in the air as the truth set in. And Martha? She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't even deny it. She calmly explained herself as though this were a business meeting. The boarding house, she said, was the perfect cover. Her guests supplied both meat and money. The boarders themselves consumed the evidence while paying for the privilege. She even claimed human flesh was superior, richer, more nourishing, easier to obtain than livestock on the frontier. Then she dropped her final bombshell. From her belongings, she produced another journal. This one didn't just document Deadwood Gulch. It traced her trail back years, other towns, other victims, the same gruesome pattern repeating again and again. And that's when everyone realized Deadwood hadn't created Martha. It had only uncovered her. What happened after this revelation changed everything. But that part of the story is still to come. What if I told you that one woman turned her kitchen into a slaughterhouse, her marriage vows into death sentences, and her iron cooking pot into a machine for murder? Sounds unbelievable, right? But Martha's confession revealed one of the darkest, most chilling stories the frontier had ever seen. She didn't stumble into killing. She perfected it. Year after year, she learned who to target, how to stay invisible, and how to squeeze every last use out of her victims. Deadwood Gulch wasn't her first stop. It was just the latest chapter in a decade-long trail of death. A string of towns where people vanished, their fates blamed on the brutal life of the frontier, when in reality, Martha had claimed them. And at the center of it all was a massive iron cooking pot. Not just any pot either. She had it custom-made by a blacksmith in Illinois, with exact measurements big enough to handle whole torsos, thick enough to hold heat for hours, and cleverly built with drainage so she could separate fat from meat. It wasn't cookware, it was a murder tool, engineered for her craft. She spoke of it with pride, like an artisan describing her finest work. The fat became lard for other recipes. The meat fed her boarders. Nothing went to waste. Over time, Martha became a butcher in every sense. She could break down a body with the skill of a surgeon, dividing cuts based on texture, fat, and use. She knew how to cure meat so it lasted months. She knew which spices could disguise the too sweet flavor of human flesh, and which cooking methods could mimic the taste of pork or beef. Her recipes were the result of years of quiet experimentation. Her boarding house made the perfect cover. The nearest settlement was more than a day's ride away, and disappearances were normal out here. Miners came and went, often never seen again. The land itself killed people all the time, so who would suspect her? Even the town doctor never caught on. Dr. Mills, like most frontier physicians, worked mostly on guesswork. He diagnosed by surface symptoms. Martha studied these patterns and made her victims look sick. Fevers, stomach pains, all leading to deaths that seemed natural. The scariest part was how she saw her victims. With the cold detachment of a farmer sizing up livestock, she judged their build, their weight, and the yield she could get. Her journals read like twisted ledgers: personality quirks, daily habits, emotional weaknesses. Information she used to reel them in. She didn't kill randomly. She hunted deliberately. Strong, healthy men with no family ties, wealthy enough to be worth it, lonely enough not to be missed. She lured them in with charm, tested their finances, isolated them from the community. And once they were dependent on her, she sealed their fate with marriage. The ceremony wasn't about love, it was a countdown. Soon after came the final step: their disappearance. Her operation was disturbingly professional. Her cellar was designed for storage, with temperature and humidity controls. Her cured meats were labeled, preserved, and organized like any merchant's stock. A single victim could feed her household for months, and she didn't just consume them, she profited. Jewelry, gold, and personal effects were funneled through shady traders in distant towns who never asked questions. The money kept her boarding house running and funded her movements when it was time to vanish and start again. When the truth finally came out, the evidence was overwhelming. Peter, with his military discipline, knew how to preserve evidence and keep records. He and Thomas cataloged everything: the journals, the tools, the cellar, the pot. Piece by piece, they exposed Martha not as a desperate woman, but as a calculated predator. Her pride, her craft, her careful system of cooking, curing, and covering her tracks. It all poured out in her confession. She spoke with the pride of someone explaining their life's work. What if the person feeding you every night, the one you trusted most, was secretly keeping trophies from the people she'd killed? That's exactly what investigators uncovered when they got their hands on Martha's journals. And what they found inside shocked even the toughest men of Deadwood Gulch. Those journals weren't just notes. They were ledgers. Meticulous records of her victims going back more than 10 years and across at least 6 different frontier towns. Every page detailed a man's name, his build, his money, how he died, and even how his body yielded when butchered. She wrote about them like cuts of meat. And in her root cellar, the proof was stacked neatly, wrapped, labeled, and dated. Each package marked with the victim's name and the way she planned to use it. But it wasn't just food. She kept keepsakes: wedding bands, pocket watches, gold nuggets, documents. A twisted museum of the lives she'd stolen. Some of the engravings revealed touching details: dedications from wives, notes from children, reminders of families waiting for men who would never return. Peter also found something even bigger: evidence that Martha wasn't working alone. Letters, financial records, even coded correspondence showed she had connections to criminals in other territories. These people had helped her vanish, change names, and set up new lives whenever suspicion crept too close. That meant her crimes weren't isolated. They might have been part of something much larger, an organized network stretching across the frontier. Martha had become a ghost with a dozen names, each identity carefully crafted with forged documents that frontier towns, with their poor record-keeping, could never question. She blended in so well she could restart her bloody trade almost anywhere. Thomas's role as a butcher made him vital in exposing her. He explained in detail how human flesh was not the same as animal meat, and why Martha's cooking tricks had worked so well to fool them all. His expertise gave the survivors confidence that this wasn't rumor or panic, it was fact. The realization crushed the borders. Men who had once praised her meals now vomited, sobbed, or shut down completely. Some needed medical attention, their bodies reacting violently to the truth. Dr. Mills, who had once diagnosed so many of Martha's victims with natural ailments, now admitted he had missed the signs. His re-examinations proved what Peter and Thomas already knew. These men hadn't died from fever or dysentery. They had been murdered. But here was the problem. Deadwood Gulch wasn't prepared for this. No sheriff, no jail, no legal system. Just a mining camp trying to survive. And now, they were staring down crimes darker than anyone had imagined. With no formal justice, mob violence was ready to erupt. Some screamed for Martha to be hanged on the spot. Others refused to believe it could even be true. And through it all, Martha stayed calm, almost eerily calm. She cooked. She served meals. She acted as if nothing was happening, even as evidence of her crimes piled up around her. Was it arrogance, or was her mind so detached that reality simply didn't matter? Peter knew the chaos had to be contained. If the mob acted rashly, Martha might slip away, or worse, the town might tear itself apart. He rallied the steadier men and pushed for order, trying to build something like a fair process, at least enough to ensure the truth came out. The evidence kept growing. Miners remembered seeing her drag bundles into the woods. Merchants recalled her strange requests for tools and supplies. Piece by piece, the puzzle showed a woman who had been planning this for years with frightening precision. And then came the letters. Correspondence that tied her to criminals beyond Deadwood Gulch. Networks that might have been running the same horrors in other towns. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one woman. It was about how many others might be out there, doing the same thing under different names. Martha tried to explain it all away. She claimed the meat in her cellar came from livestock, that the jewelry and gold were just belongings left behind, that her journals were nothing more than fiction. But Thomas's eye for meat cuts and Peter's training as an investigator shredded her excuses apart. The truth was undeniable, and that truth cut deeper than anyone expected. It wasn't just about murder. It wasn't even just about cannibalism. It was about trust. Trust in neighbors and wives and the very fabric of the community. After Martha, no one in Deadwood Gulch looked at each other the same way again. So, how do you stop someone who turns love into a trap, meals into murder, and a whole town into her accomplices without even knowing it? What happens to a town when the heart of its community turns out to be a house of horrors? Deadwood Gulch was never the same after Martha's secrets came to light. The bonds that held neighbors together snapped almost overnight. The boarding house, once the beating heart of the settlement, wasn't just a place to sleep and eat. It was where deals were made, friendships forged, news exchanged. And suddenly it was poisoned, tainted forever by the revelation that people had been fed human flesh at its tables. Families packed up in a hurry. Some couldn't bear to stay where such things had happened. Others feared Martha hadn't acted alone, that accomplices might still be hiding nearby, or worse, that more criminals would see the town as easy prey. The miners suffered the most. Imagine realizing the hearty stew you'd eaten after long days underground hadn't come from an animal at all. Nausea, revulsion. Some men couldn't eat solid food for weeks. Dr. Mills found himself treating conditions he'd never seen before. Grown men breaking down under the horror that they had unknowingly taken part in cannibalism. And then there was the betrayal. Martha's success as a cook and businesswoman, built on murder. Her tears at losing husband after husband, pure performance. For the townsfolk, the hardest part wasn't just the crimes, it was realizing they'd trusted her, admired her, and been fooled so completely. Even the preacher wasn't spared. Reverend Williams, who had married Martha to each of her husbands, was crushed by the thought that he'd been used in her schemes. His sermons afterward became darker, warning of evil wearing the mask of goodness, of deception that could live right under your nose. But the settlement had more than emotional wounds to deal with. There were practical nightmares, too. The boarding house had to be sealed off. Evidence was everywhere. And that iron pot Martha had used, massive, impossible to ignore, and horrifying in what it represented. Too important to throw away, too revolting to keep. Then came the question of justice. Many demanded immediate execution, no trial, no delay. But Peter argued that the community needed precedent. They needed documentation, proof, something to protect other settlements from the same fate. Reluctantly, the people agreed. There would be a trial. Williams, despite being deeply shaken, stepped in as judge. His background in moral reasoning made him the closest thing Deadwood Gulch had to a legal authority. A jury of local men was chosen, though their objectivity was shaky at best. Peter took on the role of prosecutor, relying on his military precision to build a timeline, organize the evidence, and leave no room for denial. And the evidence? It was damning. Testimony from neighbors. Suspicious behavior now made sense in hindsight. Most importantly, Thomas Brennan's words carried weight no one could ignore. As a former butcher, he could explain the difference between animal meat and human flesh. He described how Martha's cooking had raised his suspicions. And finally, how he'd uncovered the remains hidden in her root cellar. Handling the evidence was almost unbearable. Preserved body parts had to be shown, enough to convince the jury, but not so much that it shattered the community even further. Then came Martha's journals. They revealed everything: her methods, her recipes, the chilling level of detail she recorded. But the very pages that proved her guilt also raised another fear. What if someone else used them as a guide? No one in town wanted to defend Martha. The only arguments made circled around her sanity. Was someone capable of such things even truly responsible for their actions? But her planning, her intelligence, the sheer calculation behind it all, made the insanity defense almost impossible to believe. The trial began on March 26th, 5 days long, the most complex legal proceeding the town had ever seen. The only building big enough, a warehouse, was turned into a makeshift courtroom. Everyone came. Everyone wanted to hear. Peter opened the case with sharp precision, laying out the charges, hammering home the calculated nature of her crimes. No sympathy, no excuses, just cold, undeniable fact. The first day covered Martha's string of marriages, the husbands who arrived, married quickly, and died just as fast. Testimony stacked one on top of another until coincidence was no longer possible. The second day belonged to Thomas Brennan. His expertise, his descriptions, his discoveries, these became the cornerstone of the prosecution. His words stripped away any remaining doubt, and what happened next would decide Martha Sinclair's fate and haunt Deadwood Gulch forever. What happens when a trial is so shocking? It tears apart everything a community thought it knew about justice, morality, and even survival. By the third day in court, the people of Deadwood Gulch had already heard enough to make their blood run cold. But more was coming. Neighbors took the stand, recalling little things they'd once brushed aside. Strange glances, odd habits, small details that seemed harmless then, but looked sinister now. And then Dr. Mills stepped forward. He admitted that the string of deaths he'd written off as natural were anything but. His testimony showed just how deeply Martha had exploited the weaknesses of frontier medicine. Day 4 was the most harrowing. Peter laid out Martha's journals and her meticulous records, lists of victims, notes on butchering, even her criteria for choosing who would die next. The words hit like hammer blows. Jurors turned pale. Spectators wept. But it had to be read aloud. Every line was proof of just how far her crimes had reached. And Martha? She never lifted a finger to defend herself. She didn't even try. No testimony, no pleas. She sat calm, unshaken, as if the trial didn't matter. Or worse, as if she believed she'd still slip away from consequences. She didn't flinch when her victims were described in graphic detail. She didn't blink at the community's grief. The prosecution closed with fire. Peter called her murders not just crimes, but something beyond evil. Systematic, deliberate, and carried out with a coldness that demanded the harshest punishment. He pressed that the case must be documented to warn other towns, so no one else would ever fall victim to someone like her. The jury didn't hesitate. Less than 2 hours of deliberation, and the verdict was in, guilty on every count. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. People wept with relief, but the horror wasn't gone. How could it be? They'd just confirmed their darkest suspicions were true. The sentencing brought even more raw emotion. Survivors spoke. Families described the trauma of discovering they had unknowingly eaten human flesh. Others spoke about the shattering of trust, the permanent scars left on the town. The demand was clear: the death penalty. Nothing less would suffice. Reverend Williams, the man who had once married Martha to her victims, gave the sentencing. He admitted that her actions defied the very framework of sin and redemption. But justice, he said, demanded an earthly reckoning. His voice trembled as he declared the sentence. Martha Sinclair would hang, and Martha? She barely reacted. No tears, no anger, no apologies. Her only request was that her infamous cooking pot be destroyed. The community agreed immediately. Her execution was scheduled for dawn the very next day. No one wanted to risk a delay. Too dangerous, too costly, too painful to drag out. March 31st, 1855. Nearly the entire town gathered. The gallows stood ready. Williams offered a short prayer about protecting the innocent. And Martha, she gave no apologies. Her final words were chilling. She claimed she wasn't the only one, that others like her were out there across the frontier, hiding behind the same masks of respectability. And then, silence. The rope tightened. It was over. But the aftermath was just beginning. Her great iron pot was smashed to pieces, scattered so it could never be used again. The boarding house was burned to the ground. The cellar where she'd hidden her victims was sealed forever under stone and earth. Within days, only the foundation stones remained, but the wounds ran deeper than buildings. Families fled Deadwood Gulch. Those who stayed were plagued by anxiety and suspicion. The settlement's spirit was broken. Within 6 months, it was abandoned entirely, swallowed by wilderness. Dr. Mills filed reports about what he'd missed, pushing for better medical training and closer communication between settlements. His warnings saved lives in the years that followed. Thomas Brannan, the butcher whose testimony had broken the case open, wrote a meticulous account for the territorial archives before leaving for California. He lived quietly until his death in 1889. Peter, hardened by what he'd seen, went on to become a territorial marshal, hunting down other unusual and brutal crimes across the frontier. The legend of Martha Sinclair spread like wildfire. Her story became a warning, proof that even the most respectable face could hide unimaginable evil. Historians today call her one of America's earliest serial killers. Her methods, her planning, her cold pragmatism, treating cannibalism like a business, still fascinate criminologists, and yet the land itself has tried to forget. Deadwood Gulch is long gone, only scattered stones and a sunken cellar mark where it once stood. Locals resist memorials, they want the story buried. But not everything stayed hidden. In 1967, workers digging a road uncovered Martha's old pot, exactly where the records said it had been buried. Inside were bone fragments, human. The find was so disturbing, the coroner refused to make the report public. The pot was quickly reburied, this time in a secret location. Martha had warned she wasn't the only one. Was she right? Were there others like her, roaming isolated settlements, taking advantage of the wilderness to hide their crimes? We may never know. What we do know is this: the tale of Martha Sinclair proves that sometimes the real monsters aren't lurking in the dark woods. They're standing right beside you, smiling, feeding you dinner. So what do you think? Do you believe we've uncovered all of Martha's victims? Or could there be more that history has buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this chilling story hooked you, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who loves dark history, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of horror and mystery.